Welcome back to the set of the Talk of Paris with our guest in a live link-up with Washington, Brent Scowcroft, the former advisor to three U.S. presidents, Nixon, Ford and George Bush Sr. Brent Scowcroft, who coined this famous phrase on the New World Order. Today, what assessment do you make of the two mandates of George Bush Jr., George W. Bush? You courageously denounced the war in Iraq. This warning was not heeded by the current president. What's your assessment? Do you think he really is the worst president the U.S. has ever had?
Well, I'm not in a position of making historical assessments. I believe that I would leave it to history to judge. We've had presidents who at the time were thought to be outstanding, who history has graded low, and others who ended office nearly in disgrace, like President Truman, who have gone on to assume a place at the top of our great presidents. So I think I would rather pass that question.
But regarding the war in Iraq against Saddam Hussein, it was almost a Shakespearean tragedy between George Bush father and son. You were advisor to the son. How did things happen? Was there a big conflict between the two men?
I don't think so. My sense is that the father said, I was president, I had my chance. My son is president now. I'm not going to sit here and look over his shoulder and tell him how he ought to behave. So I believe that he assumed the position of observer rather than of confidant.
But the 41st president had been elected. He was against the second war against Saddam Hussein, was he not?
Oh, I don't believe he ever said he was for it or against it. If he did, I do not recall that.
I'd like to remind our viewers that you appointed Condoleezza Rice to the White House. Condi Rice, who then went on to become the first black Secretary of State. What assessment do you make of her action? Are you satisfied with your pupil, your former pupil?
Well, I think I'm very proud of my pupil. I think she has gone very far. She's a very young woman. She undertook an extremely difficult job at an extremely difficult time in American foreign policy. And the problems were daunting, and I think she did her best at it.
At the same time, she did not prevent the war in Iraq, so her influence was not strong enough didn't weigh heavily enough relative to Mr. Rumsfeld or Mr. Cheney.
Well, I'm not privy to all the inner workings of the 43rd president and how they made that decision and who supported it and who didn't. Certainly, it did not turn out to be one of the most fortuitous that this country's ever made. But as I say, I don't know who was responsible for what part of that decision.
So let's talk about the future. In your view, would Hillary Clinton be a good choice to succeed Condoleezza Rice at the Department of State?
I think Senator Clinton is a very responsible, sound, solid thinker. I think she did an outstanding job on the Senate Armed Services Committee. She knows a good deal about foreign policy, and I would be very comfortable to see her as Secretary of State.
And she herself supported the war in Iraq, unlike Barack Obama. So how will things turn out between the two to foresee the future U.S. policy on Iraq?
Well, I believe at this point that who supported and who opposed the war is largely irrelevant. We are where we are, and the important thing to me is that we leave Iraq in a position that it represents a force for stability in that difficult region, the Middle East, rather than a force for chaos and conflict. And so I think the future is broadly open, and who supported or who opposed the war is history now, and does not affect the way we should think looking forward.
Regarding Iraq, do you think in how much time do you think the U.S. should leave?
I do not believe we should leave Iraq based on the calendar. I believe we should leave Iraq based on the situation on the ground. It's improving steadily now, and that's optimistic. And I think as it improves, we can withdraw some of our troops that are involved in the actual conflict. The Iraqi army is getting much more capable in dealing and preserving the security of the country. But behind the frontline troops, the United States is still providing much of the support for the Iraqi army: artillery, helicopters, supplies, infrastructure, intelligence. That will take time to train the Iraqis. And then there's a political situation, which we don't and can't control. But we need to judge at what point and at what rate we can draw down, and at what point we can say, all right, we have done enough. Iraq is able to stand on its stable, constructive feet as a force for good in the region. And I put a date on it, I think, would be a mistake.
But do you think, nevertheless, that the Americans, the boys, should have left Iraq before the end of the first mandate of Barack Obama, that is to say, within the next 4 years?
Not necessarily. I would hope that things would progress rapidly enough for that to be possible, but I think that's a matter for judgment, not the calendar.
Very well. Let's now look at the other major war for the new president, a question by a special advisor to the IFRI Institute, Dominique Moisy, a question on Afghanistan.
Good afternoon, Brent. The priority of President Barack Obama when it comes to foreign policy will be apparently on Afghanistan. Do you think sending more troops to Afghanistan will contribute to the solution? Or do you think there is really no military solution there?
Yes, well, I agree with my friend that there is not or should not be a political solution to Afghanistan. It's a very different problem than Iraq, and it needs to be treated differently. Afghanistan has a long history, but it's a history of a country that is loosely joined together at the top, a loose confederation, if you will, of tribal leaders, warlords, regional leaders, governed by a very light touch from the center. And I believe that that's what we should focus on. That is not a military solution. And I believe we should be looking around for ways to recreate the Afghanistan which existed before the Soviets went in. The Soviets tried a military solution to Afghanistan, and we should look seriously at what happened to the Soviet effort. After all, they had over twice the troops that we and our NATO allies have there now, and they were unable to succeed. So, yes, I think we need to look for other alternatives and be focused on an Afghanistan which is not a perfect model of parliamentary democracy in a highly centralized state, but an Afghanistan which is, again, not a menace as it was when it sheltered the al-Qaeda terrorists for training camps. And that's, after all, why we went in the first place.
Let's listen to another question by somebody who knows you very well, Pierre Lelouch. Is Obama a realist or an idealist? Let's listen to Pierre Lelouch's question.
Hi, Brent. I hope you're well. Perhaps you remember the conversation we had in your office a few years ago at the beginning of the war in Iraq over the debate between the realists and the neocons. You were part of the realists, of course, and against the war. You thought it was a mistake. The question I wanted to ask you is the following. Do you think Obama belongs to the realist school, or do you think he may be tempted by some of the idealistic trends of thought that we have known in the past and some of the Democratic presidents? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question from my dear friend, Pierre. Candidate Obama has described what he would undertake. It seems to me that he comes closer to the realist school in the sense that he would try to find out what the motives and goals of other countries are as a beginning to how to deal with them, rather than setting idealistic goals and struggling whatever the facts on the ground are to achieve them. But it's something that our president-elect has not really revealed in terms of his diplomatic philosophy.
Well, you think that the master word will be negotiations, including with Iran?
Well, yes, and that's an indication to me that what he seeks is to find out what the others' operating parameters are, what the points are on which agreement is possible, what the points on irreconcilable points are. That is, to me, a realistic approach. You take a solid appraisal of what the ground is, and then you try to take advantage of that ground and move forward, rather than start with the ideal and try to make the ground fit the reality.
And if there's no agreement with the Iranians, they continue to produce enriched uranium and get the atomic bomb, do you think Barack Obama should bombard nuclear power stations in Iran?
But see, if I've been characterized by your questioners as a realist. As a realist, I wouldn't start with the final question, what if? I would start with what can we do to try to avoid that final question and deal with the question not in the beginning, but at the end. And I think we have not done all that we can to avoid the possibility that Iran would develop a nuclear weapon.
Let's listen to the last question of the program by Dominique Moisy of IFRI.
There was a recent report released by the American administration on the state of the world in 2025, demonstrating that America will be part of a multipolar world and no longer the unique, indispensable nation of the world. What do you think of that?
Well, I thank my friend Dominique for that question. I believe that the nature of power in the world is changing. And I think that globalization is affecting that as it is everything else. National borders are eroding. States can no longer provide for themselves or their citizens independently, as is the case through much of history. Many of the basic problems we face, whether it's health issues, climate issues, financial issues, spill across national borders. And I think that is causing a change in the nature of national power. Certainly at the end of the Cold War, the United States stood alone in terms of the traditional elements of national power, probably since the time of the Roman Empire. But look what happened in Iraq. A very small nation has in a sense, tied the United States in knots. And I think what we're going to see is a multipolar world, but that's a term of the 20th century. I think we're going to see a a softening of the sharp edges of national power, because countries are going to have to reach out to other countries in order to deal increasingly with the number of problems in the world. And I think we're going to see more of a blending than of multipolarity. Because multipolarity implies groups against groups, and I think that's likely to diminish somewhat in the coming years.
But as the historian Fukuyama said, it will be the end of America Incorporated, the end of the hyperpower of the United States in 2025.
I believe that's true. And you know, that was the end of the Cold War was a unique period in history. The end of World War II marked the diminution of the power of the traditional great powers, who were weakened by World War I and World War II. And the Cold War exhausted one of the two that was left, the Soviet Union, and there was remaining the United States. But the state of the world is changing and evolving, and I think this notion of the hyperpower, in terms of the ability to get results from the exercise of power, is diminishing rapidly, and the exercise of power will require cooperation in order to achieve results.
Very well. Thank you very much, Brent Scowcroft, for having been our guest, our 100th guest on the Talk of Paris. Thank you for having participated in this program. I'd also like to thank all those who helped me to prepare it: Julia Dorner, Sarah Brown, Juliette Igier, Pierre Gabas and Jean Le Sieur, and of course all the technical teams of France 24. Thank you to all of you, and join us again very soon on France 24.